Thank you for the introduction, Anne. Good morning all, and thank you for joining me as I talk about Victoria's premier Light Horse Regiment of the First World War, the unique 4th Light Horse Regiment. Studying, researching and writing Australian military history are passions of mine, and I hope I can share them with you. As a young man serving as a sergeant in the ranks of the 4th 19th Prince of Wales Light Horse Regiment, I had the good fortune to meet some of the men of the original 4th Light Horse Regiment. By then old, they regard me with stories, many humorous, most, I later learned, somewhat sanitised, and I also began to understand that there were parts of the story they'd left out, the bits too awful to recall. About 20 years ago, I wrote what I then knew as part of a wider regimental history of the whole of the 4th 19th. The successor regiment, raised in 1948 with the creation of the Citizen Military Forces, successor to the old 4th. But later on, I had a nagging suspicion that somehow I hadn't done the old boys of the 4th proper justice in Hooves, Wheels and Tracks. So gradually, and with the benefit of the internet, I began to retell the tale. Retiring from full-time employment some years ago allowed me to complete the task. My book, Endure and Fight, was the result. Don't ask me if you can have one, I've sold them all. The title of the book is the regiment's unofficial motto. That's the unofficial crest that the officers used on their letterhead. The book chronicles the story of the only unit in the whole of the AIF that served on each of the 3 major fronts where Australians fought. That is, on Gallipoli, in Egypt and Palestine, and in France and Belgium, or as we know it, the Western Front. I'll explain later how that comes about. Enlistment for the 4th began in August 1914, and the quota, which was a little over 500 officers and men, most but not all already serving in the militia, was quickly filled. Whilst these men had to meet stringent physical standards and to be of unblemished character, incidentally, above all, they had to be able to ride, and to ride well. Some of them, like Regimental No. 1 Joe Knott, brought their own horse with them when they enlisted. I might mention Joe later became the regiment's most decorated officer. I might also mention that No. 1's got nothing to do with when you enlisted, it's to do with your posting and or your alphabetical number. Someone who says, oh, Dad's number 12, so he was the 12th man to enlist, that is not necessarily the case. After training at Broadmeadows and then parading through the streets of Melbourne, incidentally, that band that led them was mounted, and they weren't 4th Light Horsemen at all, and most of the soldiers had bets on how quickly the tuba player would fall off his horse. After that, they sailed aboard the HMAT A18 Wiltshire on the 19th of October 1914. There they are leaving Port Melbourne. They arrived in Cairo on or about the 11th of December, and mounted training began about 10 days later. They needed to let the horses acclimatise after the voyage across the Indian Ocean. The training continued well into the new year in the hot, dusty Egyptian desert. There were also little incidents like the Battle of the Wazza. I met a number of the 4th Light Horse boys who assured me they were there, but only watched. When the infantry went to Gallipoli, the Light Horsemen didn't. It was regarded and generally held that the condition of the country was somewhat forbidding of the horse. It's also been revealed, though, that some of the senior officers were worried that 3 brigades of light horse and all their associated headquarters would rather muck up the command structure. Nonetheless, about a month after the initial landing, the light horse, including the 4th, were brought to Gallipoli. For most of its time on the peninsula, the 4th served down at the southern end, the less glamorous end, if you like, at places you've probably never heard of, like Ryries or Leens or Tasmania or Chatham Posts. Incidentally, they were down there, they were fighting and they were sick, so a lot of them died, and most of them who died, if they're not buried at sea, are buried today in Shell Green Cemetery, which is on the old artillery track that runs from the beach up to Lone Pine. I'm quite proud I took that photo. It's a beautiful cemetery. Besides the southern end, they spent occasional turns on German Officers' Ridge. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. Or in Shrapnel Gully. That was a photo taken by one of the boys who I knew, and I don't know how good you are at photography, but the original print that came from is about that big. Shrapnel Gully, even at Lone Pine on relief. Like all of the Australian forces, they were evacuated in the middle of December 1915 and returned to Egypt. Back there, early in 1916, the regiment was split up into 2 groups, each group about squadron strength. That about 120 men, although a squadron's probably more accurately 150. One of those groups was reinforced up to 2 squadron strength, and perhaps I should point out there are 3 squadrons in a regiment, and it was married up with a New Zealand squadron of the Otago Mounted Rifles. They're not Boy Scouts, that is the hat the Kiwis wear. Those 2 squadrons plus the Otago Mounted Rifles were sent to France, and they were formed into what became known as the 2nd Anzac Corps Mounted Troops. Later in 1917, when the 1 and 2 Anzac Corps were amalgamated into the 1st Australian Corps, these light horsemen were seconded to the British 22nd Corps, and they became therefore detached from the Australian forces fighting in France, and they in fact came to be under direct British command. They weren't always employed as scouts or reconnaissance men or whatever, as light horsemen should have been. Rather, because of the nature of the war in 1916 and 1917, they were sometimes used to assist the engineers clean up devastated villages like that. That's Albert. Or they worked as military police. Sometimes they escorted German prisoners. I love this painting. I just think that's marvellous. The laconic Australian light horseman slouched on his horse, marching a line of German prisoners somewhere. On occasions, they even helped local farmers bring in their crops. So you get the impression that the light horse group, such as it was, wasn't much employed in its proper job, if you like, during 1916 and 1917, but on occasion it was. I think probably all of you know something of Fromelles, that dreadful disaster of the 15th Brigade. Straight after the horrible night where there were 5,500 Australian casualties, the boys of the 4th were called on into the trenches at Fromelles to replace some of the casualties. Later on, they served at Messines in 1917. That's a great photograph, and it shows you. Can you imagine riding a horse with one of those helmets bobbing around on your head? It would be awful. They also went to Passchendaele and were around Ypres later in 1917. Then in 1918, at last, and remember they're now under British control, they moved along the River Lys and were at a place called Montkemmel in the first half of the year. Then they went down to join the French on the River Marne in July. A consequence of that move with the French down to the Marne is that the 4th remains the only unit of the entire Australian Imperial Force that was awarded the Battle Honour Marne. While they were down there, they were even given some French tanks. The commanding officer, who was a Victorian, Stan Hindhoff, wrote in his diary, "And what the hell do I do with these?" After its journey to the south, the regiment then returned to the Somme in August, and then again rode further north and across the Belgian border as the war drew to a close. I think that these horsemen were the only Australian troops still actively involved on the ground in the fighting at the time of the armistice. One of them was wounded on the 10th of November 1918. And as you probably know, the Australian Corps was resting at this stage, having fought against the Germans and been withdrawn for a time. So soon after the war ended, the boys from the 4th Light Horse, the 2 squadrons, were amalgamated with the only other Light Horse Regiment in France, which happened to be the 13th, also a Victorian unit. So we've got the 4th and the 13th together as one, all titled the 13th. Keep that in mind for something I'll tell you later. Amongst other things, as the war ended, they marched past the then Prince of Wales, perhaps later better known as Edward VIII, before he abdicated. Can you imagine that little sort of muddy street somewhere in Belgium, marching past the future king? After that, they returned to England, and by about the middle of 1919, most of them were back home in Australia. Meanwhile, if we go back now to Egypt and the other group that had survived on Gallipoli, they were more gradually reinforced up to full 3 squadron strength by mid-1917. So in effect, by that time, the middle of 1917, there are actually 5 squadrons of 4th Light Horse, 2 on the Western Front, 3 in Egypt. They were employed on what was known as Suez Canal patrol, riding, in fact, as I can understand, fairly aimlessly up and down the canal to make sure neither insurgents nor Turks had anything more to do with taking the canal. A number of them were disenchanted, if you like, with this sort of activity, and they left the regiment and joined other units: the artillery, the flying corps, the cyclists. Pause for a moment and contemplate going to war on a bicycle. Quite a number of them did. Now, somewhat confusingly, the 4th Light Horse Regiment in Egypt becomes part of the 4th Light Horse Brigade. This, for amateur historians and researchers, has led to all sorts of peculiarities. Incidentally, while we're on 3s, there are 3 regiments to a brigade. So the 4th Light Horse Brigade now has the 4th Light Horse Regiment, the 11th Light Horse Regiment, and the 12th Light Horse Regiment as its component parts, plus a few other bits and pieces. We're somewhere in the middle of 1917. By this time, a lot of other Australian, British, New Zealand troops had crossed the Sinai Desert and had got to the border with what was then called Palestine. It's now Israel. And they had attempted to take a place which we sadly have all heard of these days, Gaza. They'd attempted to take Gaza twice and for various reasons hadn't succeeded. By the time the 4th got to within cooey of Gaza, there was a new commander-in-chief, a fellow called Allenby, and he'd decided to give up on Gaza for a while and go inland to a place called Beersheba, or Beersheba as it is today. In October, once resupply and so on had been organised, it was determined that Beersheba would be taken. The activity of the day stalled somewhat. By the late afternoon of the 31st of October 1917, however, General Harry Chauvel ordered Brigadier William Grant's 4th Light Horse Brigade to charge the town. The 11th Regiment was away further back and unable to be called up. So, with the 4th on the right and the 12th on the left, rifles slung over their shoulder, bayonets in their hands, not swords, they charged. Many of you will know this. The Turks, or Ottomans as we should call them, expecting them to ride up a certain distance, stop, get off, and come forward on foot, waited and waited. And it suddenly occurred to them that the Australians weren't going to dismount this time, they were just going to keep coming. Those of you that have seen the film The Light Horseman will recall that it shows that the Turks forgot to lower the sights on either their guns or their rifles. And so, in this charge that should never have worked, not only did it work, but there were very light casualties. In all, out of the somewhere up to 800 men involved, only 29 were killed. This photograph may be of the charge. I'll get into trouble with those who think it was, because I don't. One of the people I spoke to said, oh, yeah, it definitely is the photo of the charge. I said, how do you know? Oh, you can see from the shell bursts in the air. I said, well, actually, Merv, they were painted in afterwards if you've seen the original photograph. It's claimed that they were taken by a rangefinder who was out to the side of things and saw them coming. Others claim that it's a reenactment arranged by the photographer Frank Hurley. I don't know, but I come down slightly on the side of it being the reenactment. After the charge at Beersheba, the pursuit northward continued. Gaza fell fairly quickly. The push northward towards Jerusalem, which it was hoped would be taken by December, continued. The country, if you've been there, around Jerusalem is not exactly horse-friendly, and the infantry took Jerusalem by about just before Christmas of 1917. The horsemen ended up in Jerusalem at various times, but they weren't involved in the actual act of taking the town. We continue northward. At one point, it's determined that we will cross the River Jordan, which is away to the right, to the east. We'll cross the Jordan and push on in towards places like Amman and Es Salt. To get across the river, we crossed on a pontoon bridge. That's the crossing at Alger. And there were a couple of attacks, neither the attack on Es Salt nor the attack on Amman succeeded, and so the Australian Light Horse were pushed back. They were supported by the British infantry, who also had their own problems. With that attack not succeeding, coming back across the Jordan, the troops then spent an unpleasant number of months in the Jordan Valley, which is hot, horrible, has bugs, real bugs like scorpions and things. A very unpleasant place. Next came the continuing advance along the Jordan and around the Sea of Galilee on the western side until they finally reached Damascus. It was at Damascus, or soon after they reached Damascus, that it became apparent that the Turks had no more stomach for the war. And this is probably the start of the epidemic, the pandemic, if you like, of that dreadful influenza that penetrated all around the world. I think from memory there was something like 20,000 Turks ill in that hospital. So they were about to push on northward towards Homs, another place unfortunately we hear a bit about these days, when the Ottomans surrendered. And so with that surrender, after a sort of consolidation, the 4th Light Horse and other regiments crossed the Lebanons to Beirut. They got rid of all of their bits and pieces, the war had finished, and they sailed back to Egypt, fully confident that they were going to come home to Australia. Unfortunately, dare I say characteristically, there was an uprising in Egypt. And so they were rehorsed and re-equipped and spent about 6 weeks riding around in Egypt, just sort of generally putting down this insurrection. And there they are back in the field with all their kit and caboodle, which they didn't really want because all they wanted to do was go home. They too ended up back home in about the middle of 1919. That's Station Pier. I happen to live in Port Melbourne, and one thing I noticed is Station Pier really hasn't changed much. All right, that's a broad general outline of the 4th Light Horse Regiment, why it became unique in the sense of serving on the 3 fields, and how all that came about. But what I'd like now to do is tell you a bit more about the bits of history that interest me most, the blokes. 3 photographs to contemplate. There they are, the lads at Broadmeadows, all raring to go. Fit, healthy, all the equipment and the uniform looking pretty smart. One of those blokes, probably that one, later on the war earned a Victoria Cross. He was one who left the 4th Light Horse Regiment and joined the infantry, Mickey Moon. The second photograph, that's the wrong button. Second photograph, some of the officers from one of the squadrons in Egypt before they went to Gallipoli. That's Les Magar, who'd won a Victoria Cross in the Boer War. Put his age down, not up, down, to make sure he was accepted. Was probably the first officer of the 4th Light Horse Regiment. Was probably the man responsible for setting out the horse lines at the Broadmeadows camp. It's probably lucky that's not a bit clearer. They're the original members of the regiment at the end of the war, those that still retained the horses that they began the war with. The photograph, it doesn't say, but is probably, I would suggest, taken somewhere around Damascus after the war had concluded. Well, you've listened to all the boring bits. How about some stories? Amongst the 16th reinforcements to the regiment were the 4 Langtip boys from Port Albert. The 4 of them were thought to be brothers. Their father was Chinese, Chin Lang Tip. He had a young English wife. A year or 2 after his marriage, he'd also taken in her sister. Between them all, they managed to have 17 children. The last 4 boys all joined the 4th Light Horse Regiment. Their papers show them all as brothers. Well, they weren't quite. 3 had one sister as a mother, and the 4th had the other. The 2 youngest boys, who were regarded by all and sundry as twins, in fact had different mothers. The 4 boys rode together as a section. A section, here we go, changed from 3 to 4. A section is 4 men. So these 4 boys neatly made up a section and they rode together at Beersheba. All survived the war. One of them, young Les, won a Distinguished Conduct Medal for bravery in the advance on Damascus. Les also, according to family folklore, was the Australian soldier who punched a rather obnoxious British and strangely dressed officer on the nose for maltreating Turkish prisoners after Les had asked him to stop. He didn't stop, so Les snotted him. He'd never heard of Lawrence of Arabia. I said family folklore. 2 of the horsemen wounded, and we've gone to France now, 2 of the horsemen wounded by one shell at Montkemmel in France in April 1918 had the same surname, Sullivan, but were unrelated. Both were sufficiently badly wounded to be hospitalised in England before being invalided home to Australia. The story goes that one of the boys, Archie, feeling he was fit enough to return to the fray, discharged himself from hospital, hitchhiked across the English Channel. I don't quite know how you do that, but that's what it says. And he was on his way back up to join his mates in the regiment when he was caught by the British military police, who'd been alerted to look out for him. Now, they had a problem. He wasn't deserting, he was going the other way. Needing something to charge him with, they came up with resisting the king's enemies without his, the king's, permission. And returned him to hospital under arrest. Now, like Kirsty, I've done a bit of research, and I searched his file, I searched the regimental diary, I searched the brigade, for all sorts of things. All I could find out was that, in fact, Arch did nick off from hospital on a Friday night, got a few under his belt, and wanted to take on all and sundry, including the British MPs who were sent to try and arrest him. Arch was a big bloke. He's the one in the red tie. But he was returned to hospital and ultimately to Australia. Years later, when at the time I knew them, the boys used to have a monthly dinner. And they had this wonderful association, which they'd been told to keep by their original commanding officer, to keep and look after one another until the last of them was gone. Arch was the president of the association for many years. The dinner, and I had the privilege of attending many of them, began when Arch sat at the head of the table, accompanied by a bottle of Mr. Walker's Best. Johnny Walker. The meeting went on, and it was tremendously friendly and wonderful, and the meeting didn't conclude until Mr. Walker was empty. When dear old Arch did pass away, a number of us were fairly certain there'd be no need for any embalming fluid. The other Sullivan, Arthur, lost a leg when he was hit at Kemmel, but he survived and returned home to live a long life here. I knew both of them quite well. What's the significance of the name Sullivan? Now, I have had a glance round. I did nick off for a minute. I suggest some of you at least would be old enough to remember that there was a television series called The Sullivans. Ian Jones, who had a great deal to do with writing and producing that series, was also a student of the 4th Light Horse. He too knew Arch and Arthur well. If you remember, in The Sullivans, when Dave Sullivan and his mate, the barman Jack, got kitted out for their Anzac Day march each year, they put on a Light Horse uniform, the 4th Light Horse colour patch on their shoulders. The significance then of the name Sullivan. Not all the tales were good and bright and happy. A sad one was, well, perhaps I better not say his name. It's all right because he's actually a New Zealander. With a few beers in him one evening during the approach march to Jerusalem in November 1917, he asked his mates to leave him behind on the way back to the lines because there was a young lady in the next village that he wanted to visit. He didn't return that night, or the next, or for some time. Hoping he'd evade sanction when he did turn up, neither his troop sergeant nor his troop leader, who'd been with him, reported him. But after about a month, it became obvious that he wasn't around anymore. There was an investigation and nothing could be found. This got kicked up to higher and higher authorities until ultimately it became to the very senior parts of the Desert Mounted Corps, and there was a senior British officer, Major Geoffrey Seabag Montefiore, DSO, and a whole lot of other stuff. He was called in to investigate, and he discovered that the unfortunate trooper had actually seriously miscalculated. The girl was not only not interested in him, she was engaged to the son of the local headman. The headman's son and his mates took exception to the behaviour of this slightly drunken New Zealander and decided to teach him a lesson, so they beat him up. Unfortunately, they killed him. Fearful of the consequences when this was discovered, this is the yucky bit, if you don't want to hear, put your fingers in your ear, they dismembered him and threw his remains down a disused well where they were not discovered until June 1918. Oh, that's his name. Oh, that's his headstone. What I point out is the poignancy of the headstone, the comment, missed and gone from those who loved him. So that was one thing I maybe shouldn't have brought up. Here's another one. This is to do with one of the serious but often not much spoken about problems during the war. As you probably know, casualties arose as much from sickness as wounds, and amongst the worst of all was venereal disease. If contracted, the soldier was hospitalised and his pay stopped for the period of his convalescence. Early in the war, he'd actually been sent home in disgrace to Langwarrin in Victoria, and then discharged dishonourably from the army. Towards the end of the war, rather than completely stop his pay, it was reduced for the period of his convalescence. All of this led to interesting consequences. One irate mother wrote to the Department of Defence demanding to know why her son's deferred pay was no longer being sent. With what I thought was surprising sensitivity, the department wrote back to her suggesting she write to her son and ask him why. Of course, there were those who should not have volunteered and gone to war at all. Trooper Lewis Grant springs to mind, and I hope none of his relatives are here. Amongst a litany of misdemeanours that included numerous absences without leave, insubordinate language to both officers and NCOs, and the contracting of venereal disease 3 times, it becomes apparent that his behaviour is not simply that of a madman or a loony or something, but it's in fact to do with the simple sense that he's terrified of actually being in the trenches or in the front line. So he does anything he could to avoid it. Well, that's what it seems. Of course, that wouldn't have been recognised at the time, but more recent research by people like Peter Stanley suggests that there were a number of men in these sort of categories. Anyway, years later, the same man attempted to have his lost discharge papers reissued, and all the correspondence to do with this is on his archive file. I might add, it's interesting reading because the discharge papers were lost, stolen, burnt, and washed away in a flood. It changed every time he wrote a letter, and he wrote a lot of letters, which you'll hear in a minute. Trying to sort this out, he also was told he was a member of the 13th Light Horse Regiment, not the 4th. He said, but I've never been a member of the 13th, I was only ever in the 4th. He's then told that the 4th and the 13th, as I mentioned earlier, were amalgamated. He said, but I wasn't aware of that. They wrote back and said, well, probably not, because you're in a military prison at the time. The series of his letters, which begin in February 1935 and continue on up to August 1949, have the following letterheads. HM Jail, Pentridge, Albury Jail, Maitland Jail, HM Jail, Dubbo, HM Jail, Ballarat, and HM Prison, Townsville. Clearly the lad got about a bit, but probably not only should he never have enlisted, he had some trouble adjusting to civilian life when he came home. Either that or he's got to be one of the worst crooks ever. So there are lots and lots of stories, thousands, obviously one for every one of the 2,500 men who served at some time in the regiment. Amongst them, Bill McKissick, who was a 12th reinforcement. Bill kept a meticulous diary, which I have a copy of. Bill was awarded a military medal for riding through barrages, artillery barrages, carrying messages. He was awarded a military medal. On the day of the action that resulted in his military medal, his diary is unusually silent. Then there's this bloke, who I reckon's terrific, Clary Atkinson. Is that Jack the Lad, or is it? I mean, Clary volunteered and became a medical corporal. He also kept a diary. It is the most wonderful, revealing library. Everything from officers falling down drunk, him getting drunk and painting funny iodine things on people's arms when they were supposed to be inoculated. You name it, he got up to... also, one of his entries when he's on Gallipoli says something about, I'm enjoying being here, but I'd much rather be home having a cuddle with Gwen. He also mentions that the night before the embarkation, he spent the night with a number of young ladies from Coburg and returned to the regiment the next morning quite tired out. Clary was killed on Gallipoli, going with his mate Harold for a swim, shot by a sniper in June 1915. My other 4th Light Horse hero, Les Magar, who I talked about earlier. There he is in his old militia uniform on the left. That's his grave on the right in the Beersheba War Cemetery. It's not a bad photo, I can say that I took it. I mentioned that he was probably the 4th first officer and so on, that he was transferred into the 8th Light Horse. He was killed on the night of the charge at Beersheba. A German aeroplane flew over his headquarters and dropped a bomb, hand bomb, which struck him but didn't explode. However, the force of it shattered his shoulder and his upper arm, spooked his horse. The horse took off, and this man is a very good horseman. His men found the horse later, covered in blood, and then later they found Les. There are variations on the story of what happened next, but he ended up in a casualty clearing station where he died from a loss of blood on the 1st of November, the night after the charge. That photo, or the left-hand side of the shrine, of the slide, is actually from the label of the Magar's Hill Winery. If any of you enjoy a red wine, can I commend, and I'm not on commission, Jenny Houghton makes a very good Shiraz and a very good Cabernet Sauvignon. The winery is just off the Hume Highway near Euroa. I might ring her and ask her for commission after that. Randolph Cleaver, the butcher from Sale, the first man from Sale to enlist in the AIF, was killed in the charge. Shouldn't have even been in the charge. He'd sent a letter home to his sister, a very long letter explaining all sorts of things, but including a suggestion that some of the officers were pinching the parcels that were supposed to be going to the men. Randolph's sister wrote back to the officers of the regiment asking that he be sent home on compassionate leave because his father was dying. Unfortunately, she included the letter which he'd sent as part of her endorsement of the request. Needless to say, the request was denied, and poor Randolph was one of the 9 4th Light Horsemen who died in the charge. Young Harold Wickham, or Bell as he said he was, he lied about his age and his name, gave his next of kin as his father but said it was his uncle. Imagine the family's confusion when they were told that a nephew they didn't have had been killed in the charge at Beersheba. The only person they knew was their 16-year-old son who they thought was off jackarooing. Harold was only 16. He stood just 5'4" tall, sorry for the old currency, and weighed 8 stone. Don't you reckon that the doctor might have said, "Son, are you sure you're 21? There are hundreds more stories, but we haven't got any more time. After the war, the regiment was presented with what's known as a guidon in the Light Horse. Not the regiment of the AIF, but its successor, the 4th Corangamite Light Horse. That guidon was passed on to the 4th 19th Prince of Wales Light Horse Regiment when it was formed in 1948 and was subsequently laid up in the Shrine of Remembrance where it still hangs to this day. I mentioned that many of the old boys continued to meet. That's the slide that I had at the start. That's Arthur Sullivan, the one who lost his leg. He was the last of the surviving members who also was missing a leg. He died at the age of 103. He told me he was in the charge at Beersheba and naughty boy he wasn't. Now we're running short of time. Since all of the old boys have gone, friends and relatives have formed what's called a memorial association to carry on their tradition, and we meet occasionally and go to the shrine every year for a pilgrimage in February. Quick notes, but mercifully I think Kirsty covered far more than I was going to. The places that I use mostly for starting points, the National Archives, you can either get a hard copy like that or do it on the net, naa.gov.au. Obviously the Australian War Memorial for individuals, for units, for all sorts of things. Publish histories, be careful of those. I think if you've got anything from Kirsty and I, you've discovered that be careful is the watchword with the information you gather. Other sources, if it's a famous person, the ADB, a Dictionary of Biography, the official history, both the Army 12 volumes and the 3 medical volumes, Google, Wikipedia, Trove, Ancestry.com with all of the reservations we've mentioned. As I close, what I would like to do is read what historian Bill Gamage said of the Australian Light Horsemen. The fierce individuality with which he fought Turks, Arabs and English staff officers lay close to the heart of the Australian Light Horseman. He lived under few restraints and was equally careless of man, God and nature. Yet he stood by his own standards firmly, remaining brave in battle, loyal to his mates, generous to the Turks and pledged to his king and country. His speech betrayed few of his enthusiasms and he accepted success and failure equally without demonstration. But the confident dash of the horseman, combined with the practical resource and equanimity of the bushman in him, moved him alike over the wilderness of Sinai and the hills of the Holy Land. Probably his kind will not be seen again, for the conditions of war and peace and romance that produced him have almost entirely disappeared. Thank you.